Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking something absolutely fascinating about human behavior, strategy, and power. We're looking at Law 18 from Robert Greene's deep dive into the mechanics of influence, which is commonly known as the fortress fallacy. If you've ever felt the overwhelming urge to just shut your door, turn off your phone, and completely block out the world when things get chaotic, well, you're definitely going to want to pay close attention to this one. Because understanding this law is going to completely reframe how you think about safety, vulnerability, and control in both your personal and professional life.
So, let me ask you, does isolating yourself actually make you more secure? Think about it for a second. It's our most basic, hardwired human instinct. When we feel threatened, or when the pressure is really on, our natural reaction is to retreat, right? We want to build walls, keep the bad out, and just hunker down until the storm passes. And honestly, it makes total logical sense at first glance. But what if that exact instinct is the very thing that destroys us? What if the walls we build to keep our enemies out actually just trap us inside with our own worst vulnerabilities?
Let's look at why our defensive instincts so often backfire in Section 1, the Fortress Fallacy.
The core foundational rule we are exploring today is this: do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. Now, I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive. A fortress is literally designed for protection. It's meant to be an impenetrable stronghold. But in the realm of strategy and human dynamics, a fortress is actually a trap. When you build a fortress, you're physically and psychologically cutting yourself off from the natural flow of information. And as we'll see, information is the very lifeblood of power and survival.
Let's break down exactly what this means. The fortress fallacy is that dangerous instinct to retreat and seal yourself off when you're threatened, which ultimately cuts you off from reality and creates massive vulnerability. You see, when leaders, or anyone really, experience intense paranoia or extreme stress, they tend to withdraw, completely convinced that they're making themselves safe. But in reality, they're just blinding themselves. They stop hearing the whispers. They stop seeing those subtle shifts in their environment. Their perspective narrows down so much that they end up living in a completely alternate reality. And once you lose your grip on reality, you completely lose your ability to anticipate danger.
Okay, let's dive into this with our first historical case study in Section 2, the isolated emperor.
Let's walk through the timeline of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, starting with a man who held immense, literally world-shaping power. He wasn't just any ruler. He successfully unified China and centralized his entire empire, creating this unprecedented bureaucratic system that brought millions of people under his absolute control. As his power grew, naturally, so did his desire for security. I mean, he famously ordered the construction of early sections of the Great Wall just to keep external threats out. But despite all of his monumental achievements, the guy had one fatal flaw: crippling paranoia. As time passed, his fear of betrayal just grew exponentially. He began to suspect absolutely everyone around him: his most loyal ministers, his generals, even his own family. So, to protect himself from this perceived internal threat, he completely withdrew. He built this massive labyrinthine palace and sealed himself off entirely from the outside world, refusing to even be seen by the very people he ruled.
There is a brilliant quote that perfectly captures the tragic cost of this fortress mentality. Cut off from his people, he lost touch with reality. He genuinely thought his isolation was his greatest shield, but it became his ultimate downfall. By removing himself from daily interactions and the raw, unfiltered truth of his own empire, he essentially built an inescapable echo chamber of his own fears.
So what did this isolation actually cost him? Well, everything. First, he became completely blind to the resentment that was brewing among his subjects and his inner circle. Because he wasn't present to gauge the actual mood of the empire, rebellions literally began to spark without his knowledge. Second, he had absolutely zero idea what was happening outside his palace walls. He relied entirely on secondhand information. And third, and this is absolutely the most critical part, because he was so isolated, he became an incredibly easy target to control and deceive. The handful of advisors he actually allowed into his inner sanctum quickly realized, hey, we control his reality. They controlled all the information flowing in and out of his chambers. They could filter the news, exaggerate threats, or just hide their own treacherous behavior. His isolation paradoxically made the most powerful man in the empire the absolute easiest person to manipulate.
This sets up a really sharp contrast for us. On one hand, we have the fortress mentality of Qin Shi Huang, who built walls out of paranoia to seal himself off and consequently lost touch with reality altogether. But contrast that directly with King Louis XIV of France, who championed what we call the center mentality.
Louis XIV took the exact opposite approach to power. He built a massive palace too, but not to hide from his enemies. He built it to gather them. He prioritized extreme visibility and, as a direct result, maintained absolute control over his empire.
Let's look at how he flipped this whole concept on its head in Section 3, the Sun King's strategy.
A leader who hides is a leader who loses power. Louis XIV understood this fundamental truth on a profound level. He knew that the very moment you vanish from the public eye, the moment you retreat into the shadows out of fear or just exhaustion, you aren't actually protecting yourself. Instead, you're literally handing over your control of the narrative and the environment to other people. True power requires presence. So, instead of hiding, Louis utilized the concept of the center of activity. This essentially means placing yourself directly in the middle of conversations, networks, and the general flow of information, so that no plot, no sneaky alliance, and no threat can form without your explicit knowledge. You aren't playing defense behind a stone wall. You are embodying supreme situational awareness. In the real world, this means being accessible, listening to multiple factions, understanding the social web, and making sure all roads essentially lead back to you. When you are at the center, information flows towards you naturally, which gives you the time and insight to maneuver long before a threat ever fully materializes.
The brilliance of this is perfectly captured in the Versailles strategy. Louis XIV built the magnificent Grand Palace of Versailles, but he didn't design it as a bunker. No way. He built it as this grand stage to surround himself with the French nobility. He required the most powerful, potentially dangerous nobles to come and live right there with him at the palace. He kept his potential enemies incredibly close so he could watch their every single move. And even more brilliantly, he kept them constantly occupied with court life, endless ceremonies, and trivial gossip, perfectly distracting them from plotting any actual rebellion. He stayed highly visible, deeply involved in their daily routines, and completely aware of the shifting social dynamics. Because he placed himself at the absolute center of activity, no one could scheme against him without him hearing about it first. And the results? He secured his reign for over half a century. He neutralized his enemies by essentially bringing them right into his living room.
So let's translate these grand historical maneuvers into actionable modern strategies in our final section, surviving the isolation trap.
So the crucial point is, how do you and I actually apply this to our own lives? How do we avoid the fortress fallacy in our careers, our businesses, and our personal relationships? Well, you have to proactively apply these 3 steps. Step 1, be where the action is. Stay involved in the conversations, the networks, and the decisions happening around you. Keep your ear to the ground and remain genuinely accessible to others. Step 2, expand your network. Do not let yourself become siloed in your specific department, your immediate team, or just your standard friend group. Reach out and purposefully connect across boundaries. And step 3, be fluid and keep moving. Don't become a static, predictable target that is easy to isolate.
Now, a really crucial warning to remember here is to avoid relying on a small circle. This is exactly where the seed of paranoia starts to sprout. If you only listen to a handful of people, whether they're your advisors, your friends, or just specific media sources, you completely lose your broader perspective. Your reality very quickly becomes whatever those few people tell you it is. By deliberately staying connected and expanding your network to diverse groups, you prevent threats from catching you off guard. You'll hear the rumblings long before they become earthquakes.
Think about it like this. Just like in warfare, a moving target is harder to hit. This perfectly sums up the defense against isolation. If you're mixing with different groups, if you're frequently shifting your environments and keeping your adversaries guessing, you make yourself practically impossible to isolate. The more you engage with the world, the harder it is for anyone to corner you or cut off your lifelines. Conversely, the more you hide away behind your perceived walls of safety, the easier you are to control and eventually defeat.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for this explainer. I want you to ask yourself honestly, are your current boundaries protecting you or are they isolating you? It is a very fine line between healthy self-preservation and building a fortress that ultimately traps you. So the next time you feel that overwhelming urge to build a wall and shut the world out, remember Emperor Qin and remember the Sun King. Choose the center of activity, stay visible, and never let the fortress become your own prison. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.